Welcome to One Sharp Sword, cutting through to what matters most. I'm your host, Dr. P, Dr. Wayne Pernell, the exponential success coach. And today I have a guest who is Axel Meierhoefer. He was born in Germany and found his way to the United States, where he served 22 years as an Airforce aviator and instructor. He's here because actually I shared with him that it was selfish reasons. I'm learning my way around real estate, and he learned real estate investing along the way. And because of his path to experience financial freedom, he's got some lessons for all of us. So without going into too much more, I'm going to say, Axel, welcome to One Sharp Sword.
Yeah, hi, Wayne. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So you didn't wake up one day and say, hey, I'm moving to the United States and hey, I'm going to join the Air Force. That was something. What part of Germany did you grow up in, and how did you get here?
I grew up at a city called Wilhelmshaven, which is the largest deep sea port in northern Germany, and was pretty well known for not very good reasons during World War II. Now it's kind of coming back big time from what I know from friends, because it is the LNG harbor now for all the liquefied natural gas that we get from the United States to Germany. But it's also a Navy town, So to your question about the military, I originally, if I don't want to go too deep and too much time on that, but my godfather and uncle was working for Lufthansa and helped develop Lufthansa cargo, right? And at the time, when I was little, cargo, flying stuff with planes from A to B was not really a very common thing. So he was pretty early on in that. And one of the things was, at the time, for the older listeners, there were things like airline paper that was super thin, very light paper that you could write letters on and then give to the stewardess when you left the plane, and they basically airmailed it through whatever the address was.
I remember that.
Right.
I wouldn't have thought about that. I do remember.
Yeah, so that was one of the things. So I, from all the different really cool places around the world, I got these like super light airline paper letters with little notes. And every time he came to visit, he brought these little like pilot wings or little plane models and stuff. And he had this habit, even though in our household smoking was not allowed, but he was smoking pipe. And so every time he came to visit for like a couple of weeks, the place smelled like smoke from pipe. So it was kind of like a reminder. It kind of all fascinated me, even to the point my mom said any contrail that we saw in the sky, she said, oh, look, this is Uncle Gerd flying up there. Which obviously couldn't have been in every plane, but,
Right.
I was little at the time. So I got fascinated with flying and I always wanted to do it. And when I finally got out of school in 1981, dating myself here a little bit, I wanted to join the Lufthansa, did the test. It's a pretty complicated process. And then they said, yeah, you did great, but we are currently not hiring anybody because of the economy. You remember Reagan times and stuff like that, right? So actually, nowadays, people talk more about Paul Walker and what happened in the early 80s. So, and so here I was, finished with school, was completely fixated on going to Lufthansa. And I was proud that I made it through the test, and then I couldn't actually get a job. And so I'm like, okay, what do I do now? And my mom was at the time working as a civilian in the Navy and told her boss, who was like an admiral or something like that. And he said, well, he wants to fly so desperately, the Navy is flying too. So I went to a recruiting office for the Navy and said, hey, here I am. I already passed the thing for the Lufthansa application. I'm pretty sure I would pass yours too. How about I want to fly? And the guy says to me, oh, that's great. We always look for people that are passionate and motivated. But I have to tell you, the first thing you have to learn is drive a boat. I'm like, no, you get this wrong. I want to fly. I said, yeah, but first you have to. I said, no, that's not going to happen. He said, well, if you don't want to learn how to drive a boat, you got to go to the Air Force. So that's how I ended up in the Air Force and went to my training and everything. And then ultimately, I was stationed pretty close to Rammstein, for any beer drinkers, Bitburger.
Well, Rammstein is also,
Jago will know what Bitburger is. So, pretty famous beer. And during the being stationed there, I learned and was flying a Tornado, which is a swing wing fighter bomber aircraft. And I learned that there is an exchange program with the US Air Force. And I applied a few years later after I finished all my qualifications and stuff like that and became an instructor because that was one of the requirements. And initially, I didn't think I would get it. There's a separate story I'm going to spare you. And ultimately, I got a call and was told, okay, the higher ups in the military have chosen you. And in 1995, my family, my wife, my daughter, and I became over. And I transitioned, or they call it conversion training, from the plane I was flying in Germany to the F-111 in the US Air Force. Yeah, and then I did that all the way to the point, and this is pretty common in Western militaries at least, that your body is kind of giving out around 40 or so to do this kind of fighter jet stuff. And in my case, and most other people, you get a choice. Do you want to continue to be, a career officer in the military, or do you want to get out? And I wanted to see what else I could do. And so I got out after 22 years, tried being an employee for a few years. It didn't work out. And then I started my own business.
That's great. What made you decide on real estate?
Well, the business that I started was a consulting company because I knew a lot about aviation, but also during these years as an employee, which was only a little more than 4 years, I went to school because I was very fascinated about how does leadership work. I mean, you obviously get a little bit introduced when you're in the military, and I was very fortunate to, for my age, got responsibilities that were rare for that age. I was literally the international program manager for the building of a flight training center with the US Air Force in New Mexico, like $100 million investment, $2 billion of equipment being bought in, 800 Germans starting to live in a small town of Alamogordo, 25,000 people town. And I was the one that was sent to talk to the city manager and talk to the press and stuff like that. So I never really had any training other than military training on how do you actually lead, right? How do you inspire, how do you motivate, that kind of stuff. So I went to school for that, which also then made it very clear that I'm not a good employee. And so that's basically what I wanted to do for businesses. And through a couple of very strange twists and turns that are really not part of our today's conversation, I became an expert in the life science, or some people call it pharmaceutical industry. Not from a scientific perspective, but again, managing and leading in that kind of a scientific environment. And the question came up, okay, well, if you do this, if you're now basically responsible for your own business, for your own income, for your own taxes, for your own success, how can you avoid that you will have that until you die? And at the time, this is about 2001 to 3 timeframe. If you remember, that was when the dot-com bubble burst, and lots of people lost lots of money in the stock market. So I thought, okay, well, investing any kind of profits in the stock market is probably not it. What else could it be? And again, a little history. That was the time when Arnold Schwarzenegger was really big on all kinds of fronts, right? And so I didn't deliberately pick Arnold. I was just saying, what do people who make a lot of money, and obviously the ones in the media, you kind of become a little more aware, what do they do with their money? And I found out that Arnold had become one of the biggest real estate investors in Southern California at the time. So I thought there must be something to it, and looked into it and started learning and studying. And ever since been involved. And ultimately nowadays, I really allow people and help people to do the same thing that I have done by giving them access to my network and all the resources and everything that I've developed. And then I take them by the hand and mentor them so that they can avoid the mistakes that I had to make and get to the what we call time freedom point a little faster.
That's awesome. So, and that is, what do we all want? We want freedom. And what does freedom look like? Freedom is freedom with money to be able to do the things we want to do, freedom of time to be able to do the things we want to do, and to have time to do them. So the time freedom, the money freedom point is pretty impressive. What I appreciate about you, Axel, is that you had foresight. You were like, well, what do other people do that are, if they want a good life, what do they do? And you looked ahead and you said, well, then, okay, let me figure that out and follow that path. Tony Robbins is famous for saying success leaves clues. And I like that saying, success leaves clues. What do successful people do who want a certain thing? And you followed that. So that's awesome. Talk a little bit then about your business. Talk about, if someone were to connect with you, what would be, I'm in a place where I'm going, real estate seems like a great place to look around and to begin investing. Do I need a lot of money? Do I need a little money? Is it going to take away from, the path that I have, or is it something I can incorporate into what I'm doing? So I would love for you to talk about that, because you make it sound like, oh, this is accessible to anybody. Is it?
It is fundamentally accessible to anybody. I would definitely say so. If we take that scenario that you would say, okay, I found out about Axel and Ideal Wealth Grower, they exist, but I want to figure out a little bit more. The first thing we would do is what we call a strategy call. Somebody could literally just go on the website and hang out for like about 30, 40 seconds, and it pops up and says, do you want to schedule a call? And what we do in that call is, number one, I introduce people to a model that comes originally from coaching. You as a master coach may have actually heard about it. It's originally been developed by John Whitmore, and it's called the GROW model. Now, I looked at the GROW model. I really cherished the GROW model, but I felt that the GROW model as it existed really only worked for the very first session, which kind of sucks in coaching, because as you know, as a coach, you don't want to just talk once to people.
Right.
So I studied it and said, okay, I want to enhance it, at least in my opinion, by making it a little bit a different version. I call it the grower model, which is also very sneaky, part of why we call ourselves Ideal Wealth Growers. Right. So what is the grower model? It's basically saying, okay, in this initial conversation, and every so often as we're working together, is we want to look and say, what are your goals? And what I try to get out is, and this goes to Brandon Bouchard, who you might know, he coined this thing called the B hack, the big, hairy, audacious goal.
Yeah, that was around long before Brendan, by the way. That was actually Jim Collins created it. But
okay,
yes,
well, either one, they're both good guys. Whether it's Jim Collins, I'm a fan of Good to Great and stuff.
Yeah, I was in Brendan's VIP group, and anyway, yes, want a big, hairy, audacious goal, and a lot of people don't. Right. A lot of people don't know what that is.
Yeah, and the big, hairy, audacious goal I was just about to say is a life goal, right? But in our case, we try to boil it down at least to a significant extent to what does that mean financially. And it's kind of related to what we just spoke about with the time freedom point, because the time freedom point is really a point on the calendar where you reach a certain level of passive income that you have set for yourself as a goal. Right. So if you go right now, Wayne, and you would say, okay, how much money do I really need every month to pay all my bills, pay my car, pay my gas, pay my vacation, pay my mortgage or house, or all the things, and all the passions and things, your Netflix and whatever kind of hobbies you have. Just add that all together and say, okay, that is the number. And the goal or the time freedom point, and the goal with that in that context is, how can we, what is that number and how can we reach it? Let's say you would figure out, okay, I need $6,000 a month, right? Then that is your time freedom number. But you might also say, part of the reason I want to get there sooner rather than later, because I love writing books, or I love learning how to become a sorcerer or whatever,
Sure.
so, or both. And oftentimes when we are still in this kind of life phase where we exchange our time for money, then the things that we are passionate about might not be the ones that pay the best. Right. So that's part of like, okay, the big, hairy, audacious goal is a number from a financial perspective, but it's also the first imagination of how the life after reaching that point on the calendar will look like or should look like. I actually go as far, not in the first session, but in subsequent sessions, if appropriate, to ask people to write a letter to themselves. And in that letter, they're supposed to envision a scenario 3 to 5 years in the future where they're describing in a letter, almost kind of like memoir-like letter, in detail from Monday morning for 2 weeks, what happens throughout those 2 weeks in their life. And the reason I do this, I find this a fascinating exercise. I didn't invent it. Somebody told me about it, and we've used it many times, is to really kind of get yourself into thinking in detail how this life would look like. And so that's one thing that we do, the big, hairy, audacious goal. And if possible, in that first session, also talk a little bit about what might be some sub goals. Like, for example, how quickly do you aim to actually get your first property if you don't already have any? Right? For some people, they say, first, I want to learn about it, and then I'm ready to invest. There's always the risk of analysis paralysis. And other people say, well, I've been studying this forever and I can't wait. I need somebody that gives me the comfort to do the investment as soon as possible. The first one, right? So that's the G part. Then we look at what's the current reality, what's the money situation, basically in a nutshell. Then we look at what kind of opportunities are we looking for and what are the things that are in the way. So opportunities and obstacles. Opportunities goes into the discussion, are you more comfortable with something close to home and is that feasible, or further away, which I'm specializing in, living in an expensive place and investing in more better performing places, right? So some people say, well, I have, for example, had one client who was fascinated by the performance numbers of the investments that I showed her. But every time we looked at the external pictures of the properties, she said, oh, they're so ugly. I can't imagine owning something like that, right? So then we knew, okay, we got to find her new properties, new builds that probably in a style that is more accommodating. And everybody has different priorities, so I'm not judging. I'm just telling people what the implications are of that. So opportunities and obstacles. And then we look at what actions can we immediately take or make some initial action plan. It sounds a little weird because it sounds actions and you would say, okay, so that should actually be an A, but because you want to make the word grower work, the W says, what actions will you take with an emphasis of will you take? Right. So now we have identified what initial things. Maybe it is, just really making a full inventory of your financial situation, including 401ks and all that kind of stuff, or what kind of savings you really have, or what kind of expenses do you have and want to keep, versus which ones you might, like I have one client who found out that they signed up to pretty much every kind of streaming channel you can have, Hulu and Disney and Apple and what's the other one, Prime, and I don't know, there were like
goes on and on. Yes.
Yeah. And each one is like in and of itself doesn't look like that much. And it's kind of funny because I said, how did that happen? And they said, oh, we cut the cord. I said, well, how much did the cord cost? And it was like $89. I said, like, you cut the cord for $89 to be able to do $250 a month. How does that make any sense, right? Like, so anyway, so you have all these kind of different things. So what actions will you take? And within a reasonable amount of time, some things you can do within a week or two, some things take a little longer. And here is where grow normally ends, what John Whitmer wrote in his book, Performance Coaching. Now we go to E, because that's what we do when we get to the second session, but I introduce it at least in the first session that we're discussing. And that is, what are likely your experiences when you take the action? And if we do truly decide to work together and we do the second session, that will be my first question. What were the experiences you had since we last spoke? And then the R for grower is, what is the result of those experiences and actions that you took? And as soon as we finish discussing that, let's look real quick if any of these results impact to the extent that it would change any of the main or the sub goals. And that is then also the indication why this is a cycle, right? And it's very important to find out in this first conversation, what is the thing that in real estate is fascinating somebody. Some people want to do storage units. Some people want to do syndication. Some people want to do apartment complexes. And for me, it's important for your audience and you and anybody else who might listen or hear this, that we are specializing in what I call residential real estate. So single family homes, duplex, triplex, fourplex. And the reason for that is that the US government has put a certain specific set of rules in place that are basically very similar to the rules that you would apply if you were to say, I buy myself a new house. Right? And anything that has more doors or units, some people call it, than 4, so a 5-unit apartment complex, a 10-unit apartment complex, gets into a totally different category of real estate called commercial residential. And just to give your audience a quick explanation, if you go and say, okay, I'm looking for a house that I want to buy, just a regular house as an investment. And the organization that sells it says, okay, we sell this house to you for $150,000. The lender, the bank, will send an appraiser and will say, okay, well, what do you think this house is worth? And what this appraiser does after the visit is to say, okay, let me look at all the houses within about a 1-mile radius around it that are very similar to the one that Wayne wants to buy, and see how much they sold for. And there might be a range between, 135 to 160, and so 150 is probably a fair value, and that's what you get in your appraisal. As soon as you say, okay, now next door there's a 10-unit apartment complex, I want to buy that. It has nothing to do with what other apartment complexes sell for. It has only and exclusively to do with how much rent is this complex currently generating. And then you apply what's called a multiplier to say, okay, if it's, let's say, $100,000 a year in rent, and the multiplier is 5 or 7, then you buy it for 500 or 700,000. And when you ask, okay, how do people make money on it, is they have to make it better so it can rent for more, right? And if you can take it from 100,000 to 150,000 a year, then you can sell it with the same multiplier for about 30% more. Right. So in a house, you make the income through the rent and you make the income through the appreciation, but that only happens when the whole area appreciates. If your house is the only one, which can sometimes lead, you have probably heard stories where people say, oh, I renovated this thing up to the hilt, marmor and gold and granite countertops and everything. And every house in the neighborhood doesn't have any of that. Yes, you get a little bit of credit, but if every house in the neighborhood or in the general area is 150,000 and you renovated it to 250,000, no appraiser is going to give you that, right? So that's called over renovating. So there are limits. On the other hand, if it's almost falling apart, then you will have deductions too. Long story short on that, we want to identify in which area of real estate investing do you want to be? And does that match the area of real estate investing that I'm specializing in, which is like single family to fourplex? And then, if we find that is good and we identified all of those things, now obviously we can't do this all in detail in the first session, but we talk about it in general as we just have here for about 20 minutes. If somebody says, yeah, that's kind of the right way, that's the way I want to be in this particular area, I want to help, I want your help, I want your network, the insurance companies, the lenders, the providers of the properties, the property managers, all these individuals and organizations that I have developed relationships with over the last 10, 15 years. Anybody who works with us gets obviously access, not because they have to. You have totally free choice what you want to use and who you want to work with, but at least it's a good starting point. And in the end, most of the time, a good amount of these relationships get involved, just because then you don't have to worry if they're going to work or not, right? And so that's what we do. And if we then decide, okay, we like each other, we like the concept, we like the approach, then, the only other decision is, do you want to do initially a 6-month program or do you want to go lifetime? And if you are a little more on the cautious side, you can do 6 months and later upgrade if you still like it.
You know you are bigger than the life you are leading. It really is time to attend to that thing you've wanted to do or have, but you've been putting off. It's time to step into that dream you've parked for someday. It's time to claim true well-being, both personally and professionally, without giving up the success that got you here. It's time to check out Dr. Pernell's signature small group retreat, the Exponential Success Summit. Explore exponentialsuccesssummit.com. Seats are extremely limited as this is a very special small group event. www.exponentialsuccesssummit.com.
So describe this for me, because a 6-month program, you're not just teaching people how to invest in real estate. You're helping them find the properties, and you're guiding them. This is good. You're sort of helping them filter as well. So a 6-month program is not just here's the grower. It's more like here's the grower and let's get you in and do the grower model again. And like you choose a new goal and you reflect on the experiences and you do it again and again. And that's how you're building wealth, is you're helping or that's how a client of yours would build wealth, is that you help them choose a property, get in at a level that they can feel comfortable with, and build on that and build on that. And so it's 6 months to get their feet wet, maybe, and it's lifetime with you if they want to stay with you forever.
Right, exactly. And you described it very well. The thing about it is, in this first 6 months period, what we can typically accomplish is to find a property that you as a client would agree meets the criteria that we have initially established. Right. And what I mean by that, we are not looking at properties like most people that you hear ever talk about, real estate in that category by how much does it cost and that kind of stuff, and how much can it maybe gain in value over time. We look at the performance, that is the ratio between the cost that you pay to own it, to buy it, and the rent that you can make. So to give you an example, I mean, you mentioned that you have a property in Oceanside. If you didn't have a piece of land, but you had a house, for example, there, you would probably, even for a modest house, looking at something like $600,000-$700,000, maybe even up to $800,000 in value. Now, for living in it, it's fine. But as soon as you say, okay, now I want to look at it as an investment property, for our criteria on an existing house, let's say it's a $700,000 house, you would have to make close to $7,000 in rent per month. Now, even though the area around Oceanside is pretty affluent, but nobody's going to pay you $7,000 for rent per month. Now, take that same house, let's say a 3-bedroom, 2-bath with a nice little garden and a garage and stuff, and you move that to, let's say, somewhere in Ohio. That house suddenly costs, let's say, $160,000. And it is massively more likely that you find somebody who is willing to pay $1,500 or $1,600 a month in rent, versus Oceanside, where you're lucky if you get $3,500 to $4,000. So that ratio. Go ahead.
How do you find a property that not everybody has disposable income right now, right? So you find the time and the time freedom point, and you help to figure out how much do you need to make. And that's a huge step for so many people, because a lot of people are, they're at a point of, well, this is what it costs to run my life. How do I have extra money to invest? And then finding the property, because whether it's some grand house in a beautiful location, or whether it's a modest house in another beautiful location, but maybe a different part of the country where housing doesn't cost as much. There's this sense of, I know it makes sense to invest, but what if what if I don't have a boatload of cash to hand to you? How do we do that? How do you
Yeah,
get
I mean,
people there?
the first, I mean, you're not handing anything to me anyway, but it goes obviously into the investment. And I'm basically, I like to use the analogy of my role akin to the conductor of an orchestra,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I might not even be good enough to play in my own orchestra for any of the instruments, but the whole crew is going to sound horrible if they don't have a good conductor, right? So that's just on the side. But to answer your question,
No, that's a great definition of who you are, because it's not like, I mean, there are people out there where it's, you give me a certain amount, I'm going to co-invest with you, I'll put up some, and now we both own this property, and then you're eventually going to buy me out. And that is not what you do. You're not co-investing. You are an educator along the way. You are guiding. You're a coach. You guide. And
right, exactly. I'm an educator, but I also use this analogy with the conductor because when you are in the process of building your orchestra, it's going to be much easier if I can already point to like 2 handful of people that have played in my orchestra and are willing also at least part-time play in yours.
So
right?
You're talking about brokers that you're connected
brokers, lenders, like you need different lenders, and this goes into layers and layers. Everything has, which I had to learn over time. Most people say, okay, I have a bank or a mortgage company and I get my mortgage when I buy a house. Okay, that's true. But if you are in a different location and there are different kinds of properties, different kinds of investments, there's also different sources of money, right? And not every source of money is the ideal source for the type of investment. So that correlation has to be made. And that's only one little example. Same thing is true for insurance, right? Insurance for like homeowners insurance, renters insurance and stuff like that. There are companies that specialize on investment properties versus privately owned or occupied properties, right? So you want to know, you want to learn what is the deductible that I should put in and why, all those kind of things. But fundamentally, to go back to your point, as I said, people don't hand me literally the money, they invest the money into the project. But I have to say, if somebody comes to me and says, okay, I live paycheck to paycheck and I want to do real estate investing, I would basically first tell them that I wouldn't charge them for that to get in any of our programs, but I would make a recommendation how they can get into what we call the accumulation, right? And you can do this with real estate and other things. Oftentimes, people are not very aware how much money they have in different pots. One of the biggest pots that people are not aware of is 401k, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody has been an employee for quite a while, there might have been a bunch of money less now after last year than before last year, but still there could be quite a bit of money. There might be other plans that they have. They might have like a whole life insurance policy. They might have inherited something. They might have all kinds of things. So that's part of the initial analysis to say, okay, what do we really have? And just to give you kind of an idea of what is the minimum kind of entry amount, is somewhere around the $30,000 mark. If somebody says, okay, I need to work on getting $30,000, there's not one place where I could ultimately tap in to have that, then they should go into the accumulation phase. And I'm always happy to share how I do this or recommend to do this, which also includes real estate investing that can actually, through one of the providers we work with during the accumulation phase, start with $50 a month. And we use this platform just for people that are listening to say, why would you even do this as an investor? You have to keep in mind, when we want to get to the time freedom point, to your $6,000, it's not like snip the finger and suddenly there are $6,000. But in the first investment, it may make you $300 or $400 a month. Then next year you buy the second one, it makes you another $300 or $400. So now you have a certain amount. And every month you committed to putting, I hope at least like the richest man in Babylon, you put 10% into your accumulation account. That may be, depending on income, anywhere between $800, $1,000, $1,500. So let's say there are, out of your first few investments plus your own contribution, something like $1,000 or $2,000. Well, I recommend to put them into the accumulation account that is also a real estate account, and it can go in increments of $50. Right? But when somebody, if somebody came to me and say, I don't even have enough to make the first investment, meaning like I buy the first house, and keep in mind, we are always aiming initially to buy properties with 20% down, 80% from the bank, right? So if you take $150,000 house, it's 30,000 of your own money, and the rest is from the bank, right? And so if that is not there, then we would have to find out what can we do to get there. But I wouldn't charge anybody for my mentoring if you're not ready to at least make the minimum investment into your first property.
So anybody can call you and say, where am I in my process?
Right.
Which is so great. It's very generous of you. And if you start with a $150,000 home that you're after, the 20% down, this is where the $30,000 number comes from. That
right.
If you're looking at the standard, that $30,000 is 20% of $150,000, and that the bank will finance the rest. And it's a great way to start at a $150,000 home.
Right.
And the other piece that you didn't mention is, you were saying, look, if you get in and you're only able to, make maybe $300 a month as revenue, that's still $3,600 a year, right?
And that is not revenue, that's passive income.
Passive income of, here's an extra $3,600. Here you go. It's like, that's not a bad start,
No, that's actually, if you go back, and I always like to point this out, on our $30,000 investment, that's 12%. Right? Because obviously we're looking at how much does my money make, not the bank's money. Right. And the beauty, part of the reason why I'm actually focusing and really have gone in depth over the years in this residential real estate area is, for me, it's still crazy as a person originally from Germany, that there is a case where somebody says, I give you 80% of the money, but you can keep 100% of the profit.
Say that again, because that was magical.
But think about it. You buy a $150,000 house, you only put $30,000 in. You make 12% on the passive income from the rent. Now, let's just say that house in that year, in the first year after you collected your 3,600 you're collecting obviously more, but that's what's left over after everything else is paid. Let's say that property is not a super home run. It increased in value by 3%. Not a home run by any means, but that's $4,500. So now you have 3,600 and 4,500. That's, for all intents and purposes, $10,000. So now you're at a return on your $30,000 of almost 30%.
Yes.
And we have not talked about that you're also going to depreciate this property with your CPA or tax advisor over 27 and a half years. So that's about another $2,000. If you, let's say you are in a tax bracket for 30%, that's another $700, right? So you're probably going to get somewhere in the 30% area on your own $30,000 that you put in there. And that is not, calculating yourself rich. I think 3% appreciation on a property is really modest. And that's making $300, having $300 a month left over from somebody paying you $1,500 a month in rent, it's modest, right? And you paid everything. You paid insurance, you paid property management, you paid property taxes, you paid the mortgage, and then you have your $300 left. So all this is very logical, very structured, very clean. But as soon as you were to go in an area where the house is 2 or 3 times as expensive, that whole calculation doesn't work so well anymore. That's why I'm always saying the biggest important thing to learn in residential real estate investing is to look for performance. Not for pretty, not for how much could I buy it for, but what's the ratio between how much you pay and how much rent you can make.
Cool. I want to give a little kind of disclaimer that obviously I'm not a tax advisor. You're not a tax advisor.
Right. And not an investment.
Right. You have people that you work with. You advise people to go to their own tax advisors. And also, joining you is no guarantee of an increased income, but based on your experience and based on your past success, it's, people can feel comfortable with you. So
Yeah,
there's never a
exactly.
guarantee in getting in. The market goes up and down. The housing market goes up and down. The lending goes up and down. So while it's not predictable or necessarily stable, it's real estate. There's a finite space for real estate, which makes it kind of an interesting place to invest.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things that I would love to mention, if you don't mind.
Please.
You will, if you study people that have done real estate investing, almost regardless of which of the categories, and there are many, 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 and we are only playing in one. Almost everybody you will find talking about what makes something successful in this context is to do the right thing at the beginning of the deal. If you spend the time to look for the right ratio of performance in the deal, and you have to keep in mind, what I mean by that is if you want to get your $300 that we mentioned before in an environment where the interest rate on the mortgage is 8%, when this phase is behind us, which will happen sometime in the future, and you refi that property back down to 4.5%, it immediately jumps without any changes to the house or to the tenant or anything to probably $500.
Yeah.
Right. So if your property performs on the first day when you own it, it will pretty much almost guaranteed perform for the rest of its life. Now, the other thing I want to point out in this context really quick, because you mentioned and we talked about the time freedom point. That sometimes comes across like it's a goal that we want to achieve, and then we have a glorious celebration, which we should have anyway, but it is a milestone.
Yes.
It's not an end point. So I often say, okay, we go to your $6,000 that we said earlier. If we wanted to just make a very easy calculation and say you could somehow find properties that make each $500 a month in passive income, then you would know if I wanted to get 6,000, I need 12 of those. Right? Now, this is assuming that you would buy the first one and the last one, and in between you never increase rent, which is not really true. So in the reality, you probably don't need 12, you probably only need like 10. But let's just say you needed 10 and you get to buy one every year. In 10 years, you have your 10 and you're getting your $6,000, probably a little more.
So let me pause you there, because I think it's really important just conceptually. When people in general look at these giant goals, they go, how do I own 10 properties? Good, I don't need 12. How do I own 10? It's like you start with one, right? You start with one. And that is so important, that it's like you take some action, and it goes back to the grower model. You take some action. Will you take action to even explore this? Will you take action to, step in and buy your first as a pathway to your 10th, to your 12th, to your 20th?
Yeah, exactly. That's extremely important. And I mean, I can say on experience with several clients, there's a certain addictive quality to the whole thing, because as soon as you start seeing it work, people, I've had cases where they say, well, I think I could save some money on my food expenses. I'm like, what are you planning? Oh, well, ramen is really, like that's a little extreme, So, but yeah, no, you're right. I mean, people sometimes forget, right? Like, so let's say you had the third property. Each week we mentioned each makes $500. That's $1,500 plus your own contribution. Let's say you also do $1,500, so that's $3,000 a month. Every 10 months you could buy another one of those houses because you have another $30,000. Right? Sometimes it feels like how could I have $30,000 every year to invest? Well, It's not just your own money that you put in, but also the money that your investments generate that you normally have no reason to consume. Right? So you invest that obviously back into it. But what I was getting to with the time freedom point is we're doing the whole thing. On the one hand, if you had said, okay, I, Wayne, want $6,000 as soon as possible, and we get to this point when you get the $6,000, but the overall big picture, and why we call it a big, hairy, audacious goal, is really the longer term legacy. Because yes, you reach that point when the 6,000 comes in the first time as your passive income. But if you say, okay, well, let's just stick with our example to say that it took you 10 years to get there. What's happening for the rest of your life? you have 10 properties. Obviously, you could say, I don't need to add any more, but you will for sure increase the rent, if for nothing else than inflation. And guess what? What also is forgotten, at some point, not after 10 years, but in the future, after the time freedom point, your first house will get to the point where your tenants paid it off for you.
Right.
Now you don't have a mortgage anymore that costs, out of the $1,500, the mortgage at today's rates probably cost you somewhere in the area of $800 to $900. That's an additional cash flow. So at the day, like let's say in year 20, and I know this is hard to imagine that far in the future, but in year 20, when you're making like $7,000 a month and suddenly it's $8,000 a month because a house got paid off. And then next year, another one gets paid off. And 2 years later, another one gets. So the number that you will have for your life, the older you get, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And from a legacy perspective, let's say we had 10 properties. By the time that you say, okay, I go over the Rainbow Bridge, you probably have a $5 million portfolio that you can handle over through your family trust to the next generation. Right. So that's part of it. That is, I want to just point out, we're not just striving to get to the time freedom point to get to this number and then can live our passion. The bigger picture is we do this for the rest of our life and our kids, so that whatever crazy governments, crazy industries, crazy economies, crazy Federal Reserves do in the future, they will never really be threatened to lose their livelihood or have any kind of hard time to survive. That I think is an important additional aspect of it. It's not just to satisfy your passive income goals so you can live your passion, but it's doing something for the big picture of your family and the next generation.
I think that's huge. It took me personally a really long time to figure out what legacy was going to look like. Yeah. And, it's like, so do I invest? Do I, I'm just struggling to buy, and what is it going to look like? And how do I do this? And then just to have this vision, not of what it's going to look like, but what do I want it to look like?
Right.
And then to start taking the action to make it look like that. And that's the whole thing. What do you want your future to look like? What do you want your future for your kids or your kids' kids, or, any other family member? Or if you're not having kids, maybe there's an organization that you want to support.
Absolutely.
For years to come. So what legacy do you want to build and leave to others so that they go, wow, that was, what you built was really special. And you get to have a reasonable life along the way too, which is cool.
Yeah, exactly. And part of that is, we started out, and I think this is probably also a good closing capstone to say, if you look at the people that have a lot of followers, the reason, in my opinion, why they have followers is because it's much easier when you hook up with somebody. You mentioned Tony Robbins, right? Like if he does one of his things and he says, okay, I want you to run over the hot coals, you know that he himself has run over the hot coals 100 million times and never burnt himself. So it's a little different than when somebody says, okay, you're the first one. Nobody knows what happens. You run now first by yourself, right? And that's basically what I'm saying. I'm not telling anybody exactly what to buy or what to invest in, but I'm there in the same sense. I've built my portfolio. I have all the properties. I show all the properties, all the relationships, everything, and offer people to say, I have gone down this path to this time freedom point and beyond, so you can replicate.
Yes.
Instead of having to develop and invent it yourself. Yes, we need to constantly update it. Things change a little bit, but all the things that helped me to get there are going to be shared with you, which makes your likelihood of success way higher than mine was.
That's awesome. I know that you're offering the audience a mindset manual around that, how to start goal setting right away. And that's, I'm going to say it's at idealwealthgrower.com. A lot of times we get so used to saying our own name that it gets thrown away. Ideal Wealth Grower. It's like, what did you say? Ideal
exactly.
idealwealthgrower.com, and then you do the /free, and that's where we can find the mindset manual. And also, looking around Ideal Wealth Grower, you'll learn a few things, and you'll learn what Axel and his company is all about. So
thank you for mentioning that, Wayne. I mean, the big thing, just for the audience to have an idea why I did this and why it might benefit them, is I have found that a lot of people that initially have these conversations that we touched on earlier, when we just talking openly and frankly, they kind of come to realize, or they admit to themselves, that somehow they are the victim of the environment, or at least that's what they believe. And what I am trying to basically do in parallel to all the investing stuff is for them to transition and realization that they are the creator of their own future.
Very good.
Right? And so that's basically what the mindset menu helps you to do, is first do an inventory to say, where am I on that spectrum between victim and creator? And then what can I do through some exercises to get on the path to a creative mindset? And then at the third part, there's a little story of somebody who thought he needed to be an accountant and ultimately found out that he wanted to be a chef.
That's awesome. So you're helping people along the way actually uncover their passion as well, which is good.
Well, it is, but because what we're really building, we mentioned very briefly legacy, but what we're really building is that you become the CEO of your investment portfolio, right? Yeah. With all the fixings, with like a trust and a company that operates where all the rents come in and stuff like that. The mortgages are paid from. Each of the properties is held in a land trust, and all that whole structural thing that needs to be underneath, so that you are also legally protected. And part of that can only happen when you say, okay, I'm not being told what to do. I'm not in an employee relationship. It's my company. It's my investing portfolio. This is my group of properties, my insurance, my tenants, the people that work for me, insurance people, bank people, property management people. This is truly, in the sense, you are the CEO or you are the founder of this business, and you have this whole staff. Yeah, they're not employees, but you contract with all of these to make it successful. And to do that, and this in your own business, Wayne,
yes.
To be able to do this, there is a learning curve of really realizing, okay, I'm in charge.
It starts with I don't know everything,
right?
And it might be scary to be in charge, not knowing everything. I can learn it. And that's where you come in, is you can learn it. I'm teaching you to be the CEO of your business and your life. Here you go. And that's
and that's kind of like the yin and yang, right? Like the one, I call that the mechanical stuff, is all the things related to the actual investments, and the mindset stuff is what you need basically to have a solid foundation that you can grow and build and really be confident in it, so that ultimately when in a few years down the road, somebody says, hey, Wayne or Axel or whatever your name might be, what are you doing? You can say, I have a company that has investments that will secure my family forever.
That's awesome. On that note, I'm going to say thank you, Axel. That was amazing. Axel Meierhoefer, idealwealthgrower.com/free. Check out Axel's stuff. Axel, thank you so much for being here. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All righty. This is One Sharp Sword, cutting through to what matters most. My guest today, Axel Meierhoefer, and just some thought-provoking, great ideas about owning your life and setting up a legacy. So please check out his stuff. And this is, as I said, One Sharp Sword, cutting through to what matters most. We will see you here again next time.